I'm 104 years old. I taught third grade for 37 years in a town so small the post office and the barber shop shared a wall. I raised 2 children. I buried a husband. I sang in the church choir every Sunday from 1952 until my voice gave out in 2011. And for 40 of those years I carried a secret so heavy it bent my spine worse than the osteoporosis ever did. My name is Miriam. I need to tell you about the letter I never sent. Because that letter, the one still sitting in a shoebox under my bed, is the truest thing I ever wrote, and I was too afraid to mail it. You want to understand that kind of fear, you'd have to know where I grew up, what the air tasted like, what the rules were, the ones nobody wrote down but everybody followed. I was born in 1921 in Lenoir, North Carolina, foothills of the Blue Ridge. Beautiful country if you don't look too close. Red clay roads and tobacco fields and churches on every corner. My daddy ran a feed store. My mother kept the books and kept the peace. She had a way of smoothing things over. Arguments, disappointments, whole seasons of unhappiness, with a casserole and a change of subject. I learned that trick from her. Took me 90 years to unlearn it. I was a quiet child, not shy exactly, watchful. I paid attention to things other children missed, the way my teacher's hands moved when she wrote cursive on the blackboard, the way the dogwood blossoms turned brown at the edges before they fell, the way certain women in town looked at each other when they thought nobody noticed. I noticed. There was a girl named Ruth Ann Combs who sat behind me in 7th grade. She had red hair and freckles across her nose like somebody flicked a paintbrush at her. She smelled like ivory soap and cedar. We walked home together every afternoon for 2 years. One October she took my hand crossing the footbridge over Lower Creek, and I felt something move in my chest that I didn't have a name for. I was 12. The year was 1933. You couldn't Google what you were feeling. You couldn't find a community online. You couldn't even find the right book at the library because those books didn't exist. Not in Lenoir, not where I could reach them. All I knew was that holding Ruth Ann's hand felt like the first warm day after a long winter, and I knew, with the instinct children have for danger, that I could never tell a living soul. So I didn't. For 40 years. I went to Appalachian State Teachers College, became a school teacher like my mother wanted, met a man named Gerald Polk at a church picnic in 1947. He was decent, kind hands, steady job at the furniture plant. He didn't make my chest move the way Ruth Ann did, but he was safe, and in 1948, safe was the only country I knew how to live in. We married that June. I wore my mother's dress. It fit almost perfectly. The sleeves were a little too long. I kept pulling them down over my wrists during the ceremony, like I was trying to disappear inside the fabric. Gerald was a good man. I need you to hear that. He didn't drink. He didn't raise his voice. He came home every evening at 5:15 and hung his hat on the same peg by the door. He loved me the way he knew how, steady and reliable, and never once asking whether I loved him the same way back. I think he suspected I didn't. I think he decided not to mind. That kind of quiet generosity is its own form of grace. I didn't deserve it, and I never told him so. We had 2 children. Thomas came in 1950, Mary in 1953. I threw myself into mothering the way a drowning person grabs a plank. If I was busy enough, packing lunches, grading papers, sewing Halloween costumes at midnight, I didn't have to sit with the emptiness. The space between what my life looked like and what it actually felt like on the inside. Everybody thought I was happy. I smiled in all the right places, brought potato salad to every potluck, volunteered for every committee. The PTA loved me. The church loved me. Gerald loved me. And every night after the house went dark, I lay in bed next to a man I was fond of and stared at the ceiling and wondered what Ruth Ann Combs was doing with her life. That's the thing about hiding. It doesn't just take away your freedom, it takes away your attention. Half your mind is always managing the performance, checking the mask for cracks. You can't be fully present in your own life because part of you is standing guard at the door of who you really are. I taught those children all day, phonics and long division and the state capitals. I loved those kids. Every fidgety, runny-nosed, gap-toothed one of them. Teaching was the one place where I didn't feel like a fraud, because the love I had for those students was real, uncomplicated, the kind of love that doesn't need to hide. But at home, in my marriage, in the quiet hours, I was performing. And a performance that lasts 40 years isn't acting anymore. It becomes who you are. That's the cruelest part. You lose track of where the mask ends and your face begins. Gerald died in 1987, heart attack at the breakfast table. I was pouring his coffee when he slumped forward. The mug broke on the floor. I remember the sound of ceramic on linoleum more clearly than I remember the ambulance. I grieved him. That's true. I grieved the routine. I grieved the hat on the peg. I grieved the particular way he cleared his throat before saying something he thought was funny. But underneath the grief was something else, something I'm ashamed to name even now, relief. A door had opened that I hadn't opened myself, and I stood in front of it for years before I walked through. In 1994, I was 73, retired, living alone in the house Gerald and I bought in 1955. Thomas was in Charlotte. Mary was in Raleigh. They called on Sundays. I gardened. I read. I sat on the porch and watched the mountains change color. And one Tuesday afternoon in April, I drove to the Caldwell County Library and sat down at one of those brand new computers and typed Ruth Ann Combs into the search bar. My hands were shaking. 73 years old, and my hands were shaking like a teenager's. She was living in Asheville, 60 miles away. She'd married, divorced, had a daughter, worked as a bookkeeper, and somehow, through some miracle of small-town persistence, she was listed in the white pages. I wrote her a letter that night, sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a yellow legal pad, and I wrote 7 pages. I told her everything: the footbridge, the October afternoon, the feeling in my chest I couldn't name for 60 years. I told her I'd married Gerald and had children and taught school and done everything right, and none of it touched the thing I felt when she took my hand crossing Lower Creek in 1933. 7 pages, the most honest thing I ever put on paper. I folded them up, put them in an envelope, wrote her address on the front, put a stamp on it, walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. And I stood there for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the second hand on my wristwatch go around and around. Then I walked back inside, put the letter in a shoebox, slid it under my bed. I didn't mail it. I couldn't. Not because of the town, not because of the church. By 1994, the world had shifted enough that people wouldn't have burned my house down. I didn't mail it because I was terrified that Ruth Ann wouldn't remember, that the October afternoon meant nothing to her, that the thing I'd built my entire interior life around was just a 12-year-old girl holding a classmate's hand on a bridge. The rejection I could survive. The insignificance would have killed me. So the letter stayed in the shoebox, and I kept living my quiet little life, kept gardening, kept reading, kept watching the mountains. Ruth Ann died in 2003. Her daughter posted the obituary in the Asheville paper. I read it at the library, sat in that same chair at that same computer, and read about the funeral I wasn't invited to. She was 82, survived by her daughter Carolyn, 2 grandchildren, a membership at the First Presbyterian Church. Nothing in the obituary mentioned a footbridge. Nothing mentioned October. I drove home that afternoon, and I sat in my kitchen, and I cried for 2 hours. Not the way I cried when Gerald died. That was shock. That was structure collapsing. This was different. This was mourning a conversation that never happened. A door I stood in front of until it locked from the other side. I told my daughter Mary everything in 2009. She was 56. I was 88. We were sitting on this porch right here, shelling butter beans, and I just said it. No preamble, no easing in. Mary, I need to tell you something about myself. She put down the colander and she looked at me and she said, Mama, I've known since I was 15. 15. My daughter knew before I gave her permission to know. Children see through walls we think are solid. They hear the notes we're not playing. She told me she loved me and that she wished I'd told her sooner. Not for her sake, for mine. Thomas took it harder, not angry, confused. He kept saying, "But you and Daddy were happy." And I said, "Thomas, your father and I were comfortable. Comfortable isn't the same thing as happy. I loved him. But there are different kinds of love, and I spent my whole life pretending one kind was all there was." He came around. Took him a year. We don't talk about it much now, but he calls more often. That's his way. The letter is still under the bed. I take it out sometimes, unfold those yellow pages and read them. The handwriting is shaky now, was shaky then too for different reasons. Every word still feels like the rawest, truest version of who I am. People asked me what I'd do differently. Everybody asks old people that, like we're fortune tellers in reverse. And I'll tell you, I wouldn't change marrying Gerald. He gave me my children. I wouldn't change teaching. Those 37 years in that classroom were sacred ground. But I would have mailed the letter. That I would change. Not because Ruth Ann would have loved me back. Maybe she would have. Maybe she wouldn't. That's not the point. I would have mailed it because the act of telling the truth, even if the truth lands on deaf ears, changes the person who speaks it. You stand a little straighter. You breathe a little deeper. You stop renting space in your own body and you move in for good. I spent 40 years as a tenant in my own life, paying rent to fear, following rules written by people who never had to live inside my skin. And the tragedy isn't that I suffered. Plenty of people suffered worse. The tragedy is that I was right there. The truth was right there. 7 pages on a yellow legal pad, a stamp, a mailbox at the end of the driveway, and I walked back inside. I'm 104 now. My knees don't work. My eyes are cloudy. I can't shell butter beans anymore because my fingers won't close around them. But my mind is clear, and I'm telling you this because I don't want you to be 104 with a shoebox under your bed. Whatever you're hiding, whoever you're hiding, the weight of it is bending you in ways you can't see yet. You think you're protecting yourself. You're not. You're shrinking. A little bit each year. Like a tree growing in the wrong direction because somebody nailed a board across its trunk. Take the board down. Mail the letter. Make the phone call. Say the thing you've been rehearsing in the shower for 15 years. The answer might hurt. The silence will hurt worse. I promise you that. 104 years of silence qualifies me to make that promise. Ruth Ann Combs had freckles like paint splatter and hands that smelled like cedar. I loved her from the 7th grade until right now, this moment, sitting in this chair. I never told her. That's the one sentence in my whole long life I can't make peace with. Don't let it be yours.